assumptions. Because modern warfare consumes equipment at a pace that peacetime planners often underestimate. Every incoming ballistic missile may require multiple interceptor attempts. Drone attacks can arrive in large coordinated waves. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and unmanned aircraft all demand different defensive responses. The result is something military logisticians understand very well. Air-minus defense systems don't simply need launchers. They need enormous inventories of replacement missiles. And those missiles are among the most expensive and technically demanding weapons produced anywhere in the world. That's the part most television coverage skips. Building an interceptor isn't like producing artillery shells. It involves advanced guidance systems, precision electronics, specialized rocket motors, and manufacturing processes that often require years to expand, even after governments approve larger defense budgets. Factories cannot instantly multiply production. Industrial capacity has its own timeline, and war rarely waits. This is where Ukraine's position becomes especially difficult. Kyiv isn't asking only for future production. It's asking for existing inventories, weapons already sitting inside NATO arsenals. And that's where every government faces the same uncomfortable question. If we transfer more today, what remains for our own defense tomorrow? That dilemma isn't unique to one country. It's shared across nearly every European capital. Poland looks toward its eastern frontier. The Baltic states monitor developments around their borders. Germany is rebuilding military readiness after decades of limited investment. France balances commitments across Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Each government reaches a similar conclusion. Support Ukraine, but avoid creating unacceptable risks at home. From Ukraine's perspective, those calculations feel painfully slow. From Europe's perspective, they look unavoidable. Neither side is necessarily acting irrationally. They're responding to different strategic realities, and that difference explains why summit meetings often produce impressive announcements, without immediately changing conditions on the battlefield. Joint production initiatives, future procurement agreements, long-term defense cooperation, integrated European air-defense planning. All of those projects matter. All of them may strengthen European security over the coming decade. But none of them intercepts the missile tonight. That's the difference between strategy and logistics. Strategy decides what governments want. Logistics determines what they can actually deliver. History offers countless examples where military outcomes depended less on battlefield courage than on industrial endurance. Wars often become competitions between factories, supply chains, transport networks, and production capacity. The side capable of replacing losses faster usually gains an enormous long-term advantage. That reality shaped the Second World War. It influenced Cold War planning. And today, it's becoming increasingly important once again. For Ukraine, the challenge isn't simply maintaining soldiers on the front line. It's sustaining the defensive systems that allow the rest of the country to function behind the front. Because every successful interception protects far more than a single building. It protects electrical infrastructure, transportation, economic activity, civilian confidence, and perhaps most importantly, time. Time for diplomacy, time for industry, time for allies to expand production, time for governments to make decisions that cannot be rushed. The question now is whether enough time still exists. Because while Europe accelerates defense investment, the conflict continues moving at battlefield speed, and battlefields rarely pause to match production schedules. That's why this story is larger than Ukraine alone. It has become a test of something much broader. Can modern democratic alliances rebuild military-industrial capacity fast enough? After decades of assuming they would never need it again. That may become one of the defining strategic questions of this decade. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because even if Europe suddenly found the political will to send everything Ukraine is requesting, that still wouldn't solve the biggest problem. Production. Modern air-defense missiles are among the most sophisticated weapons on Earth. They're not assembled overnight. They're built through long supply chains involving advanced electronics, precision guidance systems, specialized rocket motors, and highly trained workers. Expanding those production lines isn't simply a matter of writing a larger check. It takes factories. It takes skilled labor. It takes years. And war rarely gives anyone that kind of time. That is why so many announcements coming out of European summits sound impressive. While changing very little on the battlefield in the short term, governments announced joint missile initiatives, new industrial partnerships, future production goals, continental air-defense projects. All of those programs are strategically important. But strategy operates on a timeline measured in years. Ukraine is operating on a timeline measured in days. That difference explains why President Zelensky continues repeating the same request. Not because diplomacy has failed, but because production simply hasn't caught up. Britain offers an interesting example. Since the beginning of the conflict, London has consistently positioned itself as one of Ukraine's strongest European supporters. It supplied advanced weapons early. It trained Ukrainian personnel. It often encouraged other European governments to move faster. Britain has projected leadership. Strategically, that matters. But leadership and inventory are not the same thing. Every country, regardless of how supportive it may be, faces limits imposed by its own military readiness. Air-minus defense missiles sitting inside British stockpiles also protect British bases, British infrastructure, and British forces deployed overseas. The same calculation exists in France, in Germany, in Poland, across nearly every NATO member. Supporting Ukraine is one objective. Maintaining national readiness is another. Neither objective can simply erase the other. And that's where alliance politics becomes extraordinarily complicated. Because alliances rarely fail from disagreement about goals. They struggle over burden sharing. Every government wants Ukraine to remain capable of defending itself. Few governments want to weaken their own defenses enough to make that possible immediately. That tension has existed inside alliances throughout modern history. Military economists often describe it as a burden-minus-sharing dilemma. Every participant benefits from collective security. Every participant also has incentives to preserve its own resources. The result isn't necessarily bad faith. It's simply the predictable outcome of how national interests operate. Meanwhile, another strategic shift has quietly reshaped the conversation. The United States. For decades, Washington served as Europe's ultimate military backstop. Its industrial base, its logistics network, and its global force posture gave an ATO enormous strategic depth. But American priorities have evolved. Competition in the Indo-Pacific, growing attention to China, commitments across the Middle East, modernizing its own armed forces. All of these demands compete for the same finite defense resources. Every interceptor delivered to one theater is unavailable somewhere else. Every production contract serves one priority before another. That doesn't mean America has abandoned Europe. Far from it. But it does mean European governments increasingly recognize a difficult reality. The era of assuming unlimited American military support may be ending. If Europe wants greater strategic autonomy, it must build far more of its own military capacity. That realization is already changing defense policy across the continent. Governments are increasing military spending. New ammunition plants are under construction. Missile production is expanding. Research into next-generation air-defense systems is accelerating. For European defense industries, this is the largest transformation in decades. Yet even optimistic forecasts acknowledge the same limitation. Industrial recovery cannot happen instantly. Factories require permits, engineers, supply contracts, testing, certification, production lines. Every stage consumes time, and time remains Ukraine's most valuable resource. This brings us back to the larger strategic picture. Many people still imagine modern wars primarily as contests between soldiers, but increasingly, they resemble competitions between national systems. Which economy adapts faster? Which alliance produces equipment faster? Which logistics network survives longer? Which political coalition remains united under pressure? Those questions often determine outcomes long before the final battlefield map is drawn. Russia understands this. Ukraine understands this. NATO understands this. That is why missile production, industrial output, and supply chains now receive almost as much attention inside military planning as troop movements themselves. Because wars are rarely decided by a single dramatic offensive. They are often decided by whichever side maintains sustainable capacity after months, or years, of continuous pressure. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Industrial endurance shaped the Second World War. Economic competition shaped the Cold War. Today, manufacturing resilience is once again becoming a central element of national power. And that brings us back to President Zelensky. Many observers interpret his repeated appeals as desperation. I see something different. I see a leader trying to influence the only variable still open to him. He cannot build interceptor factories across Europe. He cannot accelerate foreign production schedules by himself. He cannot decide another country's defense budget. What he can do is keep political attention focused on Ukraine's immediate needs. From his perspective, every additional battery, every shipment, every delay avoided, may protect another city for another week. Whether those efforts succeed depends on decisions made far beyond Kyiv, inside European capitals, inside defense ministries, inside boardrooms where production schedules are planned years in advance. That's why this story isn't really about one speech or one summit. It's about whether democratic societies can rebuild strategic capacity after decades of assuming large scale war belonged to the past. For 30 years, Europe enjoyed what many believed was a permanent security environment. Today, that assumption is being tested, not only by events in Ukraine, but by broader instability stretching from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and beyond. The outcome will influence far more than one conflict. It will shape how Europe thinks about defense, industry, and strategic independence for an entire generation. So what should we watch next? Not simply the next package of military aid, not the next political declaration. Watch the factories. Watch production contracts. Watch how quickly new missile manufacturing lines actually come online. Watch whether European governments move from emergency spending to long-term industrial planning, because those developments will reveal much more about the future than another headline announcing another summit. Modern wars are no longer won only by the army that fights hardest. They're increasingly won by the nation, or the alliance, that can sustain the fight the longest. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson of this entire conflict. The decisive battlefield may not be the front line at all. It may be the factory floor. Because in the end, missiles don't appear because politicians promise them. They appear because someone designed them. Someone built them. Someone transported them. And an entire industrial system kept working long enough to deliver them where they were needed. That is the real challenge facing Europe today. And whether it can meet that challenge may determine not only Ukraine's future, but the credibility of European security itself in the years ahead. I'll see you in the next one.